The following is a production of BYU Broadcasting in cooperation with the Brigham Young University Division of Continuing Education.
Of the approximately 7 billion people on Earth, approximately 0 of them are, as far as we know, immortal. Thus, everyone will eventually die. Few of us, however, think much in advance about how and where we are going to die. If you are an American in the 21st century, though, you are likely to die in a hospital, hooked up to various medical devices and monitors while receiving several different drugs through an IV. As modern medicine has continued to find new tools to prolong life, more and more people, often without really planning for this in advance, have shifted the location of their final days to a well-equipped modern hospital designed specifically to alleviate their pain and keep their lungs breathing and their hearts beating for as long as possible. This relatively new reality of dying begs the question of what doctors and nurses can best do to make that process as pain-free and worry-free as possible, both for patients and for the families that come to comfort and be with them. But this means more than just knowing the exact right drugs to prescribe or how to best analyze and synthesize the mountain of data continually produced by modern monitors. It means more, in other words, than just medical science. Instead, palliative or hospice care physicians now do double duty as life coaches or even spiritual advisors of a sort to those who are dying. This new role depends more on human empathy than on scientific rigor and implies a redefinition of medicine that includes not only the delivery of traditional bodily healing, but of dignity, acceptance, and reconciliation for those who are close to death. Our guest today on Thinking Aloud is a doctor, healthcare administrator, and writer who not only specializes in palliative care medicine, but is also one of those helping to shape the developing dialogue in medicine about the best ways to deal with dying patients. It's a new role for most doctors and nurses, and one that couldn't be more important, both for our loved ones who may soon pass away, and eventually for all 7 billion of us. Thanks for listening.
It's a great pleasure to welcome to our program today Dr. Ira Byock, who is a leading palliative care physician, an author, and a public advocate for improving care through the end of life. Byock currently serves as Executive Director and Chief Medical Officer for the Institute for Human Caring of Providence Health Services. That's a 35-hospital health system serving communities across 5 western states. Dr. Byock advances efforts to measure, monitor, and improve whole-person healthcare system-wide. He's a practicing physician, is past president of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, and titles that you are almost certain to have encountered in the past, the very well-known titles, are Dying Well, The Prospect for Growth at the End of Life. That came out many years ago. He's also author of The 4 Things That Matter Most, and more recently, the author of The Best Care Possible, A Physician's Quest to Transform Care Through the End of Life. Great pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Byock. Thank you for joining with us.
Marcus, it's a real pleasure to be here.
You've been at this for some time now, for a number of years, and because you are not just a theorist but a practitioner, it seems to me that in this matter of approaching death and working with patients who are near death or dying, how frequently are you in this position working with patients at that stage of life? Is this still something you're doing today?
It's something I'm doing less at the bedside, but I'm in contact with people who are seriously ill and, frankly, dying on an absolutely daily basis. I'm now working with colleagues who are at the bedside, trying to take what I've learned, what we collectively know in our field, frankly, and make it normal. We're trying to sort of elevate whole person care to be the new normal.
So that presupposes that it was not normal for many, many years.
It is not normal right now. We call the places that are doing it well exemplars. but they are, frankly, positive outliers in this regard, still today.
How would you characterize the way we've been going at it for decades and not doing it properly? What are the main failings of our approach to end-of-life care?
So many. I would say, in framing this, that there is a true public health crisis that surrounds the way many Americans are cared for and experience the last months, weeks, days of life, how their families experience caregiving and their family experience of losing a loved one. The components of that are, frankly, many, and they're kind of mutually reinforcing. Our health system treats disease, but is almost willfully ignorant of the real lived needs of the people with those diseases. You know, we've made huge advances in healthcare, which I am utterly fascinated with and love and celebrate and use frequently, even now in practice. The scanners, the antibiotic regimens, the surgeries, chemotherapies, all of that. But if all you do is focus on disease, at some point in time you're going to disserve the people who are ill. We have yet to make even one person on the planet immortal, which means, if you think about it, that at some point in time, more intensive disease treatments doesn't equate to better care for the person who is ill.
Is the tipping point that we're still stuck with the idea that we are primarily enacting remedial measures, the idea that we're going to remedy the situation, rather than tipping into the idea of, okay, the remedy is not there, and we are now going to address other needs? And I don't mean to imply that those are necessarily sequential, that one must follow the other, because certainly other emotional needs are present even if one does find a remedy.
I think we have to, as they say, walk and chew gum at the same time. I, for one, love the science and technology of medicine and diagnoses and disease treatments. We should do that with all vigor, frankly. We live in unprecedented times, and we should make full use of this unprecedented capacity. But the fundamental nature of illness isn't, and certainly the fundamental nature of dying, isn't medical. It's personal. So while we do the medical, we need to do it in a sophisticated fashion that takes all the value that medical diagnostics and therapeutics can offer and helps us live a full life as well as possible. But that fullness of life, and here's the cultural challenge, Marcus, is that the fullness of life has to shift to not just living as long as possible, but living as fully, as well, as lovingly, as joyfully, as possible. Because the way we're doing it, where we keep focused on quantity while really turning a blind eye to the quality of people's lived experience, isn't doing it. It's not success. Nobody thinks it's success. At very least, it's not giving us as the business people say, a return on our investment. People are dying badly, in droves, by which I mean, dying in ways they would not have wanted to be, in places they would not have wanted to be had anybody asked them. But, of course, we don't ask them. In American healthcare in general, we assume that the goal is to forestall death. There are other goals that are meaningful to human beings.
I'm wondering, what would you say about the idea that we've institutionalized this divide between treating the emotions of a person, the spiritual side, the spiritual needs, the quality of life? We've institutionalized it with the way even our administrations are set up in all of our hospitals, in our cultures, to the point where maybe even the bureaucracy is keeping us stuck.
It is. You could say that was the main thing. I actually have my own sense of what the core problem is, but the bureaucracy and the way we define quality, the way we measure it, the way we pay for services, all of that are well intended, frankly, but have unintended consequences. I think 3 millennia ago, Confucius was to have said, the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. And I actually think that's where we go awry. That the core of it is that for all of our good intentions, we have come to call illness and dying medical problems to be solved. They are only partly medical. The fundamental nature of illness and dying is personal, intensely so. It's personal for the individual who's physically ill, and it's personal for everybody who loves and cares for that person. And when you make that shift, you can begin to bring the right tools to the job. You know, we've been bringing medical tools to something that is fundamentally personal, and it's it's a little bit like trying to tighten the screw with a hammer. You can be earnest, you can be smart, you can be really persistent, but you're still likely to make kind of a mess of things.
Well, when you wrote Dying Well several years ago, in your introduction, you have a line there that I think ties in really well here. You wrote, "As a physician, being present as someone is dying tears the boundaries between the personal and professional realms of my being." Now, if as a physician you can say those kinds of things, that the boundaries somehow are torn between two different realms, personal and professional, I have to wonder at what point the patient is willing to welcome you into the personal realm. Do you have to ask permission for that? Or are you asking doctors everywhere just to be bold enough to go forward and be bold enough to just ask, may I offer something more than just medicine?
I think it's just being real in the current vernacular, frankly. I think, for one thing, those of us in medical education have done a terrible job teaching professional boundaries. We've made a hash of things. We've taught a whole generation, or several generations maybe, of physicians that professional boundaries mean not showing emotion, being aloof, not being too directly involved. And not only does that feel starchy and inauthentic to patients and families, but I can tell you it's a terrible experience for the physicians. It's a very parched, kind of bloodless, no pun intended, way of practice. I teach boundaries in a very simplistic, but I would strongly assert far more accurate and useful way. There are certain very few things physicians are not supposed to do to or with patients. And that when you learn what those are, you can actually bring your whole self to your practice, to the clinical encounter. And then, frankly, practice becomes much more satisfying. It becomes, yes, it's soulful, and things do tear at your heart because you come to know people very well. But it's not just that you're drained, because as often you're filled up by the authenticity, the real richness of the connection, of the human connection, the human interaction. Practice becomes more fun, frankly, when you can kid around with people in the office and at the bedside, where you come to know them in a way that's authentic. So that's what I do in practice is I offer the person my whole self for the time that we're together and in a authentic relationship. I'm the doctor, but that doesn't mean that that we can't have a therapeutic relationship that also has the qualities of a friendship.
You used the phrase "for the time that we're together," and I would imagine that's the biggest impediment to any kind of real investment along these lines in the experience of a patient, because patients get so little face time with doctors.
Well, we're trying to change that. Certainly in the health system that I work in, we're trying to redefine that, and I think I have some hope that you're going to see new models emerge rapidly. This is part of what gives me hope. Is that a tectonic shift has occurred in the way we're financing healthcare. And it started as Obamacare, or it started as Romney Care and has become Obamacare and all that. It is value-based purchasing actually begins to look at quality and things like expanded visits with doctors and others, medical homes and teams are now actually becoming more common rapidly. But in fact, when a physician can bring his or her whole self to the clinical encounter, to the conversation with a seriously ill patient, what I found is that time is more measured in depth than it is in length. That if you can really be present, I practiced emergency medicine for over 14 years. And I can tell you, when I was able to sort of quiet down, settle down, and just be present, the 5 minutes that I spent counseling an anxious patient, or the 10 minutes I was able to spend with a worried parent, felt like a long, long time to them. That's, in fact, the feedback I got back. But when you're divided, in time, and you can't turn off the pager and can't stop being interrupted every 45 seconds, then those visits feel like they're all involved, like they didn't happen, like it wasn't enough. Never really felt heard.
Do you ever get feedback from other doctors to the effect that this extra dimension of care is just icing on the cake instead of the actual cake itself?
I used to, but now, frankly, more and more I hear, I'm hungry to do this. Frankly, a little bit of me is jealous of you, Ira, and your team, because you get to do this stuff. This is the real heart of medicine. I think, frankly, there is a public health crisis that surrounds the way people are cared for, but the victims are not only the patients and families. Stress and, frankly, moral distress is now really common among nurses and physicians. We all know it to a certain extent that people are getting bad care. And some of my closest colleagues and friends, still work in intensive care units. Palliative care teams nowadays are spending more and more time in intensive care units and being welcomed there, because the critical care teams know that so often what they're doing is non-beneficial.
We're visiting with Dr. Ira Byock, who is a leading palliative care physician and author, a public advocate for improving care through the end of life. He's well known as author of Dying Well, The Prospect for Growth at the End of Life, also The 4 Things That Matter Most, and The Best Care Possible, a physician's quest to transform care through the end of life. I want to go back to the subtitle of that first book, Dying Well, The Prospect for Growth at the End of Life. That almost seems paradoxical to me, to be growing at the end of life. How would you talk about personal growth and explain that at that stage?
The main title, Dying Well, is often misperceived. People hear well as an adverb, modifying the experience of dying or the process of dying. And in fairness, it is. But I think the more provocative and insightful way to understand the phrase dying well is for well to be an adjective describing the person who is dying. What I have learned is that this personal experience that is illness and dying, first is fraught with risk and the potential for suffering. But also, if you pay attention, there are also instances that clearly evince a sense of well-being, where people express a sense of wellness during these times, which are also difficult, unwanted, often filled with concomitant suffering. How do we understand somebody who asks, "How are you?" and knowing full well that they are within the last weeks of life, look you in the face and say, "I'm well"? What do you make of that? Because that's the position that I was in 1978 as an intern, caring for, hospitalized patients, many of them Spanish-speaking only patients, in a county hospital, and occasionally I would have that conversation.
And it wouldn't be on.
Mr. Rodriguez, whose body was filled with cancer, on pain medicine. We got his bowels working. We've, dealt with the major physical issues. We've talked with his family. I've talked with him. He knows he is dying. And when I ask him on rounds, how are you doing today, Mr. Rodriguez, he looks me straight in the face and says, I'm well, doctor. How are you?
And it's not pleasantries. It's not just the conventional exchange that is expected. You got the distinct sense that somebody would actually be registering your question as a legitimate, straightforward question.
Yes, it didn't happen often, Marcus, but it happened enough times that I realized I didn't have a language. I didn't have a conceptual framework to put that in. How do you understand concomitant well-being? The book Dying Well is a collection of stories of real people who taught me something about this time of life, these times of life, these personal experiences that illuminated some component or aspect of well-being. It starts with my father's story. My father didn't want to die, for heaven's sakes. He didn't want to be ill. He didn't want to lose us. He suffered. He suffered physically and emotionally. And yet, there was this undeniable sense that he was well within himself. He was right with the world. He was right with all of us. Right? There was nothing critically important left unsaid.
Let's go there, because a lot of what is left undone has to do with our communications with the people we're going to leave behind or the people who will miss us. What are you advocating for primarily in the realm of interpersonal communications?
Sure. I think, firstly, we have to accept that we're imperfect. The hardest person to have a satisfying relationship with often is ourselves. We're the hardest people to forgive, right? We never live up to our own expectations, and some of that, Freud would say, some of that's just inherited from your parents, and you've got all this stuff. Got it. What I want people to know is we all have it. It's okay. You are not called to be perfect. You're just human. That's good enough. Bring some mercy to yourself. That's number one. Number two, I've tried to, I'm always afraid it sounds like pop psychology, but I have found that there are four core things that people find value of saying to one another. And in one's own words, expressing the sense of, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you, gets you a long way down the road. People say, I don't know, I'm going to go see my friend Charlie in 3 days, and he's dying, and we've been friends forever, and I don't know what to say. I start there. I don't tell them they have to say it, but I say, you ought to think about, I found often in families and with friendships that at least saying, please forgive me and I forgive you, because let's face it, there hasn't been a perfect relationship in the history of humankind, right? We're imperfect people. We have imperfect relationships. But please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you is often like stating the obvious. But boy, is it ever of value to say it out loud. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
And
if you're a parent, telling your child that you're proud to be their mother or father is a gift that will keep on giving for a lifetime. Just say it out loud. You already feel it, say it, right?
Don't you often get the sense that people can't quite find those words until they're in the closing chapter?
I have just the opposite sense. When I talk to people about these things, they almost all nod like, yeah, they get it. It resonates. Nope, this is the stuff. This is the ground substance of healthy relationships.
So you're advocating, I'm trying to hear that this is not just advice for end-of-life care and the end-of-life experience, but this is kind of life coaching for the duration of the prime of our health.
Right. It's about completing relationships, mending, tending, and nurturing relationships. And yes, if you're dying, then it's really critically important, and you can do it. Time is measured in depth, right? So you can do these things often when time is very, very short. But why wait? You don't have to be dying for these things to matter. You just have to be mortal. Or if you're immortal, if you love somebody who's mortal, well, they could die at any day. So even if you're immortal, these things would still be useful to say to one another.
The last title of the books that I've mentioned, The Best Care Possible, A Physician's Quest to Transform Care Through the End of Life. I've often wondered if we who are in the proximity to people who are dying that we love, if we don't make decisions oftentimes based upon this, a sense that we're going to regret not having done the utmost for them, whatever the utmost might be. And I think you're trying to redefine what the utmost is in terms of either expense or the technological support for end of life, or withdrawing maybe some of those more expensive treatments in the interest of greater quality. That's how can I possibly go through there and feel like I'm navigating that terrain wisely?
I wrote that book, The Best Care Possible, to give people kind of a roadmap, and it's kind of nested frameworks. As patients and families, what does the best care look like? That's the only thing I know we all want, and it's partly medical. You want the best medical treatments, the best technological care, but you also want the best care for yourself, for those you love as persons, right? As your whole person, because this is really personal time of life. But then I kind of unpacked it and looked at what the potential is, what a roadmap would look like through our health system, society, and the culture, which I think are the other major frameworks here. You know, part of the news is very, very good. What's partly maddening to me is we could have it all. We could have much better care, not just better care, but much, much better care, and reliably, and actually save a significant amount of money. What is daunting is that that's going to be very hard to achieve, frankly, because although we would say the total health care costs would fall, there are certain parts of business, pharmaceutical companies, frankly, hospitals themselves, certain interventionalist doctors, and on, durable medical equipment companies, that would not see their sales rise if we, for instance, instituted a routine, thorough decision-making so that people who, before they went to cardiac surgery or transplant surgery or cancer chemotherapy, for instance, had substantive conversations and education about what they were getting, what the potential benefits were, what the known risks, what the known burdens of the treatment are, and what the risks of treatment are. Some percentage would choose not to do those things, and you'd see Wall Street wouldn't like it on one hand. On the other hand, we would all save money, and there would be, frankly, a lot more jobs in the nursing and nurses' aides and home health and, physical therapy and counseling and all of that. Money would shift. Really hard to do right now in the very business-oriented way that healthcare is given. What I think is needed, as I explain in the book, is we really need a citizen consumer movement. It's very much like the birthing movement of the late 1960s and 70s. We need to take back this last phase of life and demand, not just better medical treatment, frankly, much better medical treatment, but we also need the really continuity and planning and support for ourselves and our families so that we can live fully during this difficult but normal time of life.
We're out of time, so I'm going to close here with just a yes-no question. Are you optimistic that society is poised to be able to move in the direction of less expensive but higher quality end-of-life care? Yes.
I think we're poised, but we have work to do to make use of that opportunity.
Yeah. Great pleasure speaking with you. Very important topics. Thank you so much, Dr. Ira Byock.
A pleasure.
Ira Byock, a leading palliative care physician, an author, a public advocate for improving care through the end of life. Titles well known of his authorship. We've already mentioned them, but here they are again for you. Dying Well, The Prospect for Growth at the End of Life, The 4 Things That Matter Most, and The Best Care Possible, a physician's quest to transform care through the end of life. You can listen to this conversation again at your convenience from our website. Come to classical89.org/thinking aloud. I'm Marcus Smith. Thanks for listening.
Thinking Aloud is a production of BYU Broadcasting, made possible in cooperation with the Brigham Young University Division of Continuing Education.